Tonight I will try to clarify 9 aspects of musical forming. The fact that I'm able to do this with the terms that I'm going to use is the result of the last 20 years. I can resume and I can point out where the development of the musical thinking, of musical composition, is going to go. In 1951, the word point music has been used for the first time casually by a music critic in Cologne, Mr. Eimert. And what he meant was this: we had heard piano pieces composed by the French composer Olivier Messiaen, and in these pieces, modes de valeur et d'intensité, the composer had reached a synthesis of his research in Indian music, his composition with ragas and talas, then his work with medieval neumes, which he used, for example, in the piece called Île de Feu, Fire Island, and his research in early Renaissance music, in which the durations as well as the small formulas of pitches were treated with equal importance, the silence having the same importance as a measured duration as the sound, and the research that he had done in the field of the Viennese music of the 20th century, in particular of the music of Anton von Webern, in which the motives and musical themes were reduced ultimately to formulas of 2 notes, so-called intervals. In the piano pieces which I have mentioned, Messiaen tried to give to a row of 12 different notes a different duration to each note and a different dynamic value and a different form of an attack. All the possible characteristics of piano sounds were differentiated from note to note. And this was the point of departure for us. When I say us, I mean people like Boulez, Barraquet, Philippot, Vanneau, Yvette Grimaud, Guivarts, the Belgian composer, and myself, having all been students of Messiaen during that time. And the French composers became all familiar with the music of the Viennese composer through René Leibowitz in Paris, who was the only one who owned the scores, and we all copied from each other the works of Schoenberg and Berg, and in particular of Webern, because the scores were not available. This synthesis led to a music which sounded to the music critic as point music. There was even the word star music used during that time because it sounded like the points in the sky. The smallest formulas of the music of Weber, I said the 2-note formulas, the intervals, were reduced in that music even further. And the first music that the composers which I have just mentioned composed, in particular the Belgian Kreutzspiel, and me being influenced by him, was then an explicit point music, which means we added the idea of the Klangfarben melody, of the melody of the music colors represented by the different instruments, or vowels, or consonants, to the idea of giving to each note a different duration, a different dynamic, a different pitch, before we would repeat a note. Working with series. There could now a lot be said about relationships between our work and the modulo of Le Corbusier, who tried to lay the basis for a new method of architecture based on the blue and the red series. The word series reoccurs in that field. Or about a lot of constructive painting that was been done during the early 50s by some constructivists. We could speak about the strong influence on the musicians through certain books during the early 50s, in particular books of Einstein. I don't mean the mathematical books, but the more general books that are generally understandable, or Heisenberg, or biologists like Wieser, the Viennese Wieser from the Neumann School, or Norbert Wiener, Man and Machine, etc. There was similar thinking everywhere. The reduction to the smallest possible element of the process of forming. And when I use the word forming, I use it in the sense that the crystallized result of a creative act, the form, being just an instant in a process, and that the whole concentration of the scientists as well as of the artists was more and more focusing on the process. And this started already in the early 50s. A famous quote from Victor von Weizsäcker, for example, a German medical specialist and biologist: the things are not in the time, but the time is in the things, occurs in the things. That's very important. The going away from the objective astronomical time, for example, in music, to the biological time, organic concept of time. This became all very important for the musicians who started anew after the last war. And we started, it's too beautiful to be true, with very systematically, with the smallest element, with the single notes. And the whole birth of electronic music is not an accident, but it is literally the result of discussions between Kreutzspiel and myself, that we wanted even to synthesize the individual notes, the timbre of the individual sounds, saying the preformed material conditions us too much, which means a clarinet and a piano, and the way how to produce these notes conditions us too much in what we want to do with it. We want to achieve a unified musical structuring, and therefore we want to make our own timbres in order to find a coherent system to derive the micro from the macro concepts and vice versa. After these fairly abstract sentences, I would like to come to musical examples. I have used words like point, group, and mass in order to generalize what is happening in music. and to make it clear that what's happening in music is just a particular manifestation of what is happening in general. I play you an excerpt from a composition which is called Counterpoints, KONTRA-PUNKTE. And the old word counterpoint, as we learned as students, to put a point, counterpoint, against a point. Punctum, punctus contra punctum. That's what we learn in school since the 15th century, when we make music. And still nowadays, this is the best training for the musical minds, to study counterpoint. It has a complete new meaning, because it literally means for the first time not melody against melody, but point against point. And in the KONTRA-PUNKTE, a work which has that title, which I composed in '51, being the second composition after another work for orchestra which is called Points for Orchestra, Points for Orchestra. This is counterpoints for orchestra. After each note there is a silence, and every instrument plays only one note, and then another instrument. Naturally I could make this clear. If you think of points, a point is not just always a dot, so to speak, in music. It can be a very long note, but it is a note which has all the characteristics on it, its individual characteristics compared to the other notes, as much as possible. Let's say I would make a blue note that were a certain color, like let's say oboe, so that you have a name. And then another one, which would be point being like this. Then the third one would start here, go up to here. And another one, which would be just that. These are, musically speaking, points, because each element is isolated. There's a silence afterwards, and they have all different pitch, they have all different durations. All the characteristics are as different as possible. If I would still try to indicate the dynamics, as we did, then I would have to make them, let's say, with different shapes. And this one would have such a form, diminuendo crescendo, this one a long crescendo. Well, and you see this amplitude, and it's louder than this one. This would be very soft. It wouldn't be very wise to do that, because the others would completely cover it, so I must make it. You see immediately already on the paper the danger of the point composition. It's if one wants to be different all the time, a monotony occurs. During the early 50s, people were saying, and still are saying nowadays, Stravinsky has quoted this several times, that this total point music becomes very monotonous, because trying to be different from element to element all the time leads again to something what they all have in common, which means to be different, or try to be different. And it levels out all the organic differences. And then we have blue, which would have such a curve, let's say. Another characteristic. No. Okay. So I try to differentiate as much as possible in size, which means in volume, as we say nowadays, the technical language. That's point music. But already in KONTRA-PUNKTE, I'm going to play the beginning of KONTRA-PUNKTE, there are naturally a few groups, because I had composed several pure point compositions before, and I broke my own system, so to speak. More and more small groups occur, which means, for example, that several notes are played by the same instrument. And you will hear after the beginning, which is a pure point music, little groups occurring, and at the end of this example, you will hear even a piano coming out and playing a whole mass of notes, and this brings us then to the terms, to the notions that we are going to discuss later. Please listen now to the beginning of KONTRA-PUNKTE. All I can say today about this period is that it was far too short. We should have composed many more and much more thoroughly works of point music. And there is still a lot to be done in the future to be even more, much more daring than we were. We have passed very quickly then to other aspects of music because the music was reborn completely, technically as well as in its aesthetics since 1951. And I would very much like to see in the future works being composed in which the point structuring spreads out individual notes, individual sound events into space, much larger spaces than we have ever dared to do it at that time. When that work was performed and other works of that same quality, the people were absolutely shocked. They said, what do individual notes mean? And we were naturally somehow influenced by this. And even getting out of our tradition in which I still learned how to compose with themes and motives and melodies, etc., I thought already that the distance between these notes was enormous. For me, a silence of 2 seconds was something that I could barely accept myself. I felt it was too long. I should go on. And nowadays, the silence of 10, 12 seconds for most of the composers is something that they are terribly afraid of. People would start talking or not listen anymore, etc. So in some of my works now, the longest I have reached is in the 10th piano piece. There are actually silences of the length up to a minute. The radio program, for example, is switched off when this happens, because the engineers are told when the silence is longer than 15 seconds they have to switch off because something is wrong. in the machine. You see, we have certain conventions about sound and silence. And these conventions can only very slowly, sometimes more violently, being changed or broken. So I would like to hear point music, and I always will recur to moments in my compositions where all of a sudden individual sounds are spread out in time and space with more and more emptiness between them so that they become more and more clear as individual notes. We come to the second stage of that process that I'm trying to describe, which is at the same time a historical process. As I say, it is a kind of systematical process which came quite naturally, not because the composers tried to be good teachers, but it just happened that, for example, groups were introduced into the musical composition. And by group I mean that a number of notes which can be counted while we are listening, which means up to 7, 8. A number of notes has at least one characteristic in common. Then the group character is fairly weak. If it's just the color, or let's say it's just a dynamic, that 8 notes are just piano, but they are all different in dynamics, all different in duration, all different in pitch, and all different in timbre, but just they would be all soft. Then they have one characteristic in common, which makes them become a group. Naturally, if all the characteristics are in common, if they are all loud and all high and all played with trumpets or have all a particular kind of timbre and have all the same duration, they are periodic, then naturally the group is the strongest. Then the individual character is lost of the 8 elements. So that's what's happening now in several works. We get more and more groups together with individual notes, with points. And from that moment on, the point doesn't exist anymore, so to speak, in a group composition, because the point is the group with the number 1. If I have 3 notes, 4 notes, 2 notes, 1 note, 5 note, 6 note, then the 1 note is the smallest group. It's a question of context. I play you an excerpt from a composition which is called Groups. Well, at that time, I didn't talk like this. That's why I say I can allow myself to speak the way I'm speaking tonight, as if everything would have been pre-planned by some divine force ahead of time. And I would have just followed for 20 years this system. It's not that way, but I can now classify or make the things more simple by using these words. Already in Groups for 3 orchestras, you may have heard about this work where 3 orchestras are surrounding the public in a horseshoe form, each group of players having its own conductor because they play in different time layers, in different tempi which are superimposed, which is impossible to realize with one man and one orchestra, with one conductor and one orchestra. Also very important aspects that groups have their own time all of a sudden. Individual notes, we say they have their own duration. But groups are beginning to have more and more their own time, their own tempo. Also something that has never occurred in the Western music since there was the common beat introduced into the music in order to control verticality, polyphony. But in the group compositions we come more and more to regions in which groups have their own time, their own metronomical time. And I used chromatic scales of tempi, of speeds. For example, 12 speeds within the ratio 1 to 2, between 60 and 120. I have worked many times with tempos tempi as I worked with pitches. In GRUPPEN, the notion of group is transcended, as in KONTRA-PUNKTE, the notion of point was transcended by introducing groups. And this always happens. It's very interesting. If one concentrates on something, on a certain aspect, then one transcends it because one cannot accept to be in a closed system. What seems to be interesting in this context is this. Whereas all the music, even the music of Weber, up to that historical moment, had been made by using certain formulas, objects, like a theme or a motive, and transform this object, vary it, transpose it, put it into sequences, even destroy it or develop it further. In the music that was written up to since 1951, there was an explicit spirit of non-figurative composition. We tried to avoid all figures that were recurring, which means all repetitions. And through this, something became very clear, that the way sounds were organizing themselves, or were organized, was the most important, and not the particular formula that occurred in a given moment. The fact that certain notes were composed as points, others as groups, that was the essential. So whenever groups would occur, points would occur, that was the recognizable element. Whereas these groups could be completely different, renewed in their intervals, in their shape. And the points could be somewhere else in a different region and of different overall quality, generally shorter or longer or higher or lower. Being points, that was the characteristic. Or being groups, or a mixture of both. So I said it once in the following terms, whereas in traditional music there was always, at least in the best, the best composed music, let's say in a development movement of a first sonata form, movement of Beethovenian composition after about Opus 50, where increasingly the through composed, the Durchführung, the through composition, the development became important. Pardon? Development. The development, you say that? Became more and more important. There's, as you know, the Fifth Symphony is always quoted as the most important. There is just one formula, which is present all the time, like in a kaleidoscope. That in the music that I'm describing, there was always the same object shown in different light. Whereas since 1950, there were always new objects shown in the same light. And that is something completely different. So naturally it was not just one light, though yes, because I used, for example, one row of proportions for all the characteristics, for durations, for pitches, for dynamics, and I still try to find a unifying proportion, a factor for proportioning for a given work. Like in Mantra, which is the last work that I composed through, so to speak, with total development, with total through composition. Can you say that? Total through leading of a formula. What? You know it, you should know. Which means there's nothing present, but all the time, for 63 minutes, the mantra, the 13-note formula, in different expansions and contractions, and 12 degrees. But it's always the same. Always new objects in the same light. And the light, that's, for example, that series of proportions, which gives birth always to new phenomena, musical events. That's interesting. And then in an increasing way, music is going in that direction. That the unifying factor is underlaying all the different events that occur. And one shouldn't be trapped too much by the events, but feel that and discover that underlaying proportioning principle, the genetic principle that gives birth to all these different musical events. You heard already in Gruppen several crowds of notes, as I might say, or collective in a sociological language, or let's say masses of notes, where we cannot count the individual notes anymore. They go beyond the group. And I always say, in group playing, for example, if someone wants to join in when we play in our group, and I say, well, 5 is good, but 6 is already dangerous. And 7, with 7 the mass begins. Because then completely different relationships between human beings start to act. I say when we cannot count any longer the elements. So this depends on the speed, naturally. If it's too fast, we can't count them anymore. And 30 notes may just occur like a gesture. And one doesn't feel like as if one should count them. Or they're just too many superimposed, like a swarm of bees, where you perceive the shape of that swarm. It becomes one again, like a tree. You don't count the leaves, but you can very precisely see that's a pine tree and not a beech. It's because of the elements. But there's something else, that is that shape, that overall form. And that is true for a mass. So for the first time in the history of Western music, composers became involved with the composition of masses of notes. And I still remember a moment during my musical education at the conservatory in Cologne when I had sometimes, it was a kind of an essay, an exercise. I didn't think I would ever become a composer at that time. And I showed it to my teacher when I had composed two very many notes in a small amount of time. Then he said, who is going to hear that? Who can hear these notes? You don't control what you are writing. You see, what is the point in writing notes and if the people can't hear them? And I said, I don't want you to count them. He says, well, what do you mean? I mean, look all these notes here. I said, yeah, I want this. He said, well, just make one note, be precise, and that's it, he said. So it was unthinkable. And at that time, in order to justify what I was interested in, I did an analysis of Debussy music, of jeu. And the program was called Statistical Characteristics in Jeu of Debussy. You can imagine and I was speaking about trends in register of certain textures, about trends of density, increasing and decreasing densities, overall densities, of predominating colors from dark to bright, or from metallic to muted colors, etc. I was inventing a complete new language. Or I was speaking of perforated music textures. I used the word textures as being opposed to structures, etc. And I spoke about rising shapes or drip form shapes, etc. Or sawtooth shapes of masses. Well, you can imagine what I'm talking about, actually. What is a saw? There you are. I make here 300 notes in 2 seconds. That's what I want. It's quite different from another one, which I make then, which has, for example, such, not a sawtooth, let's say, but a shape like a sine wave. And I'm speaking of pitches now. High, low, high, low, high, low. Here too. And then I would make in here more sustained notes. It's quite different from this one. You see? Or notes which have this characteristic here, and this one. And here I would make all trills. So I give it a certain texture, etc. I remember in groups for 3 orchestras already. I was sitting in a room in Paspels, close to Chur in Switzerland, in a room for 3 months. And I had a small window, like this, in front of my desk. And I saw these incredible shapes of the mountains on the other side of the valley. There are quite a few groups for three orchestras, which have exactly the shapes of these mountains. Where, for example, I have become a specialist in drawing such curves at that time. And then I would fill them out. For example, I would subdivide it in musical durations of equal duration, what I call like fundamental durations. Let's say these were whole notes. And then I would subdivide here. Let's say here is the formant, there, goes here, etc. So higher and higher formants like overtones, but we are speaking now of rhythm. And this were a subdivision by 2, this by 3, this by 4, this by 5, etc., this by 6. But you see, I could also, sometimes I like to make windows inside, where there was nothing. I left it out. And I started to think in shapes of musical masses, of sound masses. So we will come later on to the term statistics, statistical methods to compose masses. I play you now the end of Song of the Youth, a work which I realized in the studio of electronic music of the West German radio station in Cologne, and the process with which I realized this work has become already statistical. For example, I would give to 3 collaborators a sheet of paper, and I would say 20 seconds. And a second one, and a third one. All 20 seconds long. In order to make a certain sound event. And then I would say, during this time, you go with the speed of a pulse generator, which produces electric pulses, like this. And you start with 4 pulses per second, and you end up with 16 pulses per second. And for the second one, I would say you use a dynamic control device, a potentiometer, and during that time, you do this. This is maximum, and this is the minimum of dynamics. Let's say this is the range, as we say in technical terms, of 40 decibel, which you can see on a decibel counter. Then to the third one, I would say, and you use the electric filter, which filters these pulses. Do you understand what I'm talking about here? That is, for example, a 4 per second, which means da, 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 up to 16 per second with a pulse generator. And this then is fed into a filter, and the filter would have another curve. Let's say it would start at 4,000 cycles per second. Cycles per second, excuse me, CS. And here would be 1,000 cycles per second, to make it very simple. And then he would have to make a curve like this. Excuse me, like this. During that time, 20 seconds, then we had a stopwatch, a big stopwatch. We started it. Then at 3, we started doing these curves, and we made several examples until everybody said, all right, it's fine with me. You too? Yes? Okay. Then we would make, according to my definition, 7 layers, all of 20 seconds, and in each layer these curves are a little different, and then superimpose them all. Naturally, I can't say in which moment exactly a pulse will occur. Only the tendency I can indicate, following this curve. And the same is true, I can't say exactly at which cycle per second he will be during this time. And the same is true for the dynamics. So if you superimpose then several curves, let's say a second curve which goes like this, and the third one which goes like this, then you get the result of many different curves when you superimpose these 3 layers, 4 layers, 5 layers, 6 layers. The number of layers and the overall tendency in each musical characteristic then leads us to a certain result, which is a mass. And it has a very precise shape and a very precise tendency compared to another mass. And this composition of musical microtextures with statistical methods then has become very, very important in music in many different ways. And all the so-called chance operations in music are nothing but that. Already in the early 50s, when I studied again after having finished my music studies at the University in Bonn, communication science and phonetics, the simple analysis of noise sounds, of the wave structure in noise sounds, just led us automatically to statistical wave structures. And when I enlarge into a larger time, what I find in a single sound, like in a certain consonant, then I get entire musical sections which have the same behavior like a single noise. I think the most important discoveries in the different fields of musical form, let's say everything that happens between 8 seconds and a quarter of an hour and half an hour in music. And in rhythm and meter, everything that happens between 1/8 of a second and 1/16 of a second and 8 seconds. And everything that happens in harmony and melody, everything that is organized between 1/16 of a second and about 1/4000th of a second. These 3 regions are all interrelated. And it's interesting that when one would be able, and one is nowadays almost able, technically, to stretch a single sound into half an hour, a sound which lasts, let's say, 1 second, stretch it half an hour, then you have an overall form which has the characteristics, the subdivisions, etc., of that single sound. Or if, on the other hand, you are able to compress a whole Beethoven symphony into half a second, then you have a new sound, and its inner microstructure has been composed by Mr. Beethoven. But it has a very particular quality compared to the compression of another Beethoven symphony, not to speak of a Schoenbergian symphony, because there will occur many more aperiodicities, so the Schoenberg music will be more a noise. And the Beethoven music will be a vowel. Because it's periodic, based on periodicity. Let me play now the last part of Song of the Youth as one example of mass structuring. Naturally, there occur also groups and points. That's always the case. Same that I have said about the point composition, I could also say about the group and in particular about the mass composition. It would be desirable that and the music that is composed the precision of the masses, the shapes of the masses would increase, that we would know better how to determine precisely certain tendencies in masses of notes, and we have very little experience in that field. We have even done no research. Me as a composer, for example, I go on composing, but I have not done any systematical research, and it would be necessary because in other fields I am working with very precise measurements. But I have no precise knowledge of certain shapes, I mean of the behavior of certain shapes in certain contexts. I just do it intuitively. And I don't deny that I make many mistakes, where when I try to combine points with certain masses, then the points are completely covered. Or when I think there is a difference in certain textures within masses, they don't come out. Then I make mistakes in speeds, primarily in speeds, where I think there are still differences recognizable at high speeds. When I come to the performance, they are not. Then I have to change a lot during the rehearsals. And when I have to talk about it to other composers, or let's say to younger composers who want to work with me, then I know very little. My language is not developed to speak about these things. I use mainly words then from statistics that come from other fields. Now we come to the second set of terms, determinate, variable, and statistical. This is the way how points, how groups, how masses can be composed. I can compose actually points in a very determinate way. Groups in a determinate way. Masses in a determinate way. What does that mean? It means that I can very clearly hear the intervals, which means the proportions. I can hear very clearly the durations of the individual points, groups, and masses, their shape, etc. So I don't really need to give examples for the determinate way of structuring points, groups, and masses, because all the scores, up to 1955, 6 even of that new music, have been completely notated. All the characteristics have been determined in terms of classical scales and measurements. But a new phenomenon was the method to compose variable structures. What does that mean? I give one example, then I leave it up to you, to your imagination, to invent many more. I composed a work, ZEITMAßZE, time measures, for 5 woodwinds in 55. It was at the same time when I composed Song of the Youth in the studio. It was for 5 woodwinds, traditional ensemble, but in that work, determinate structures where you hear very clearly the individual notes, groups, sometimes masses of notes, are alternating with variable structures. For example, there's a point where all 5 instruments start together. They have played chords before. Everything that is vertical is clearly determinate, because never notes would fall just by accident together in a chord. Like, well, we don't need to go into detail. That is, a chord, and in particular sequence of chords, is always is the clear sign of determination. And in particular, if there is a progression from chord to chord, let's say from more simple to more complicated chords, and back to more simple ones, like in the classical harmony, from consonant to more dissonant chords and back to consonants. This is always the sign for high determination. But I say, when it happens as follows, that there is a point of departure, and then every instrument starts playing in a different speed. So the oboe, for example, is playing as fast as possible, a given number of notes. The bassoon is playing as slow as possible. So they separate all in different time lengths. Then the English horn is playing from as slow as possible to as fast as possible. What does it mean, as slow as possible? For a woodwind player, I write, for example, a number of notes and say, play it with one breath. And I play it as slow as possible. Actually, that changes with the size of the lung of the player, but that's not what I mean. Yes, there is a clear determination for that one player. Then another player starts as fast as possible, and it says, slow down until you reach a speed which is 4 times as slow. And then after a longer time, after some time, when everybody has played the notes that are written, they meet again, they wait for each other, and they meet again in the same time, in a metronomic time. And that is clearly marked then when the groups follow each other in a very precise form, etc., where you can count very clearly, and the different colors follow in sequence. Or when they play in chords, again, or in a clear beat of 3 or 4. I play such a section. And ZEITMAßZE now lives from the breathing of such variable structures. Why do I say variable? Because they are so-called, what I call at that time, time windows. You see, again, the words which I borrow. Let's say there are these different instruments playing at the same time. Etc. Another one is playing. I leave it with 3. And what's happening in a certain amount of time, an interval of time, can change because someone can be ahead of another one. And I have to calculate when I compose the relationships between the different pitches that everything within a certain amount of time can move, is flexible, is variable. It can vary. And that time window, so to speak, runs over the music, always with a certain width. Sometimes it becomes more narrow when it's more determined, the music. Sometimes it becomes more wide when it's more indeterminate, the music. More variable, so to speak. And then what happens inside, it varies from performance to performance. And I must count with this variation, with this interchange. So when I would just say start, and after half an hour I would say stop, then the time window naturally is half an hour long, when they can play anything. If there is no control of meeting again, or of the pitch relationships. So that time slit, or time window, through which I hear the variable characteristics of several layers running at the same time has become more and more important. That's variable music, and I play you now the section from ZEITMAßZE. That work, like many others, lives from that breathing, the instruments leaving the common time, going on in the same in individual times, and meeting again. And this now, not always all together. Sometimes one is off time, he varies a lot in relationship to the others, then 2, then 3, then 4, and then all 5. There are sections where all 5 have individual tempos. So there is a continuum between complete determination and extreme variability. And that's also the way we listen to them. We feel the music. When it's very, very determinate, then we know exactly where we are. We are in a certain beat, we are in a certain sequence of colors, and we can analyze exactly the rhythm. But when we are in a region of high variability, the music is floating. Now the word statistical is new in the context of music, naturally. It's borrowed from other fields. One example, we were asked to make statistical texts in the seminars of Professor Meyer-Eppler, random texts. Let's say he would give us, according to the principles of what he calls Markov series, just individual letters, and say, make any text with chance operations. And then he would give us individual syllables, and then individual two-syllable units, etc. And we had to try to find out what we call the degree of redundance is of the resulting texts. And he was a teacher who came from phonetics, from the field of phonetics, which means the simple analysis of the different sounds of the language led him to the studies of statistics, because he wanted to know more precisely what all the different noises are. Analyzing the wave structure of the noises led him to the methods of statistics, to describe them and to analyze them. The consonants in language. I give you now an example of a composition which is worked out with degrees of different indeterminacy, with degrees of statistical behavior of certain groups of elements, groups or masses of elements, points of elements. That means that the variability, which was here the result, as an intermediary state between determination and statistical behavior of sounds, groups, and masses, that the field, the variability, was based on lines. I gave the example where you could follow the lines very well, because one instrument was playing a whole sequence of notes, and just following the color of the instrument, you were able to follow the different speeds. Whereas in a statistical composition, the field becomes fairly wide, and one cannot follow precisely lines. So I give an example from cycles for percussionists, for one percussionist. And in this cycle for one percussionist, there are certain events which are clearly periodical. And they show by that being periodical, for example in accelerando, that they are not statistical, that they are determinate. When I do dum, ding, dum, 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 that is certainly not statistical. Because statistical means that you can permutate, change the order without that it really matters. Whereas when I change the order of the text that I have just produced with my mouth, then there is no longer direction, no longer determination. When it makes, for example, ta-ti, tum-ba-ba-ti, da-da, and then afterwards I make tim-ta-ti, da-da, da-da. It doesn't really matter, because there is no direction. It's just an irregularity of distribution of small groups. So please listen now to the following composition in these terms. Whenever you hear something that has a direction, for example, you hear a cowbell, drum, cymbal, cowbell, drum, cymbal, cowbell, drum, cymbal, triangle. Through that repetition, there is clear direction given. Whereas in others, you hear cowbell, cymbal, triangle, guero, guero, triangle, guero, cowbell, cymbal, etc. No direction. And that is and it is clearly composed in that way. Then, for example, there is a system where you have these notes which are in an accelerando until there is a change of direction. That is clear direction, like an arrow. Determination. And on top you have, let's say, over that time field, you have a box, which is like this. And in this box, you have different elements, and it says distribute these elements in any order. This would be with a tam-tam, and this would be with a cowbell, and there would be another element of that length, which would be, let's say, with a triangle. That's it. And then it says distribute them in any order, and repeat them, let's say, 5 times. I mean, not repeat them. Use them all 5 times, in any order. So the degree of statistical composition changes in such a composition between very small time field and very few elements that can be distributed up to a very large number and a long time field. There are many different degrees, and I have worked with a series of 9 degrees of statistical distribution. I'm not saying that you're supposed to find these 9 degrees out, but the music that is the result of such a method has very particular characteristics compared to another music, and that is what is important in the context of this talk. That's very determined. Now it becomes very vague. You see groups, but statistics. We have used, since the introduction of statistical methods into musical composition, the term of the band and of the width of the band. That means whatever the determination is, let's say in pitch, highest pitch, lowest pitch, or in rhythm, shortest duration, longest duration, or in timbre, the brightest used timbre in a certain texture and the darkest. What is in between such limits is called a band. And the band has a certain width. When the width of the band is 0, then we have a highly determinate situation, then there is no choice. And when the band is widening and finally going over the whole range of possibilities in pitch, when I can say, for example, any pitch, then it's the bandwidth is maximal. So between extreme determinism and the extreme relative indeterminism in a given composition, there are all the degrees composed in terms of the different widths of bands. And some composers have, since the statistical methods were introduced, completely specialized in statistical composition. For example, a man like Xenakis, or to a great extent, a composer like Ligeti, or also a composer like Penderecki. They became famous because they just specialized on one aspect. And this happens every once in a while in music as well as in all the other fields, that someone specializes on one new aspect of the field of forming. Let's say like Mark Tobey would specialize for years and years and years on certain microstructures, or textures, let's say. Or like Ligeti on band compositions, or Penderecki on clusters. They become cluster specialists. Like in other contexts, let's say the American Feldman becomes a specialist in music that is as slow as possible and as soft as possible. We have these specialists every once in a while who specialize in one very narrow field, then go very deep, but they vary it all the time. You know this in painting even more than in music, that someone has so-called style, personal style. What we mean by that is that someone narrows himself completely so that he can be identified when you even see a little bit of him, of his work. Then you can say, aha, that's Yves Klein, it's blue. And we can really say that universalists are becoming very rare in all fields. Very, very rare. We have mainly, like in all the fields of sciences, or like, let's say, in medicine or so, we have people who specialize on part of a limb, and then do nothing but that. I always say to students who are studying with me, if you want to become famous, then just take a lens, an optical lens, and put it on one of my scores, and what you see through it, you just multiply it for 5 years. For example, if you see snare drum, then you start composing about 20 pieces only with snare drums, of all different sizes, for 50 snare drums, for 20 snare drums, for 30 snare drums on a roof, snare drum in the basement. Yeah, I mean, snare drums, really, and very tiny snare drums. And then snare drums amplified, ring modulated, snare drums. Then he will be the snare drum composer. And he will be known in Japan, he will be known everywhere. You can specialize on anything, or let's say trill. Just become a trill composer. It's very easy. Or the crescendo composer, or like I say, the pianissimo composer, or the as soft as possible composer. Or the cluster composer, what have you. So I come to the last set of terms. We have traditional terms like development, of sequence and moment. Just a few musical terms. Development, more and more in the first movement of the sonata forms, the thematical development, a theme, and increasingly reduction of the number of themes. There were compositions with 3 themes, 2 themes, finally even sometimes one single theme. Leading to the extreme historically that Schoenberg said as the ultimate statement of what he wanted to do, is he said everything is development. And he had that idea, as well as Matthias Hauer, another obsessed Austrian, saying that he just wanted to work a whole universe just with one formula. And then it was not in vain, all very close together historically, when scientists announced the Einheitsformel, the formula that would be at the basis of the whole universe. You know that this word has been in the air. Heisenberg has been related several times to the Einheitsformel, to the unifying formula, etc. It's in the air. Everything is development of one thing. That's what Schoenberg said in one composition. The series, for example. Or a series of proportions. I said during the first works that I composed, I have written the word dramatic underneath. And when we hear the word dramatic, we always think something emotionally loaded. That's not necessarily true at all. Dramatic means you present figures, people, like the Greek drama, develop, and then develop it. Lead these figures through through different kinds of experiences. One gets killed, another one gets married, and the third one gets sick, another one goes to America, etc. Not in a Greek drama. It's a little early. But yeah, I mean, things happen that way. So and then he reoccurs, he comes home, a lot of things happen during the course of the journey, etc. Dramatic means that you can always follow the red thread. Even if you lose it sometimes, that even increases the dramatic force, the tension. But then, in music in particular, in Europe, in the classical time, the music had to represent the general interpretation of the universe. If the end is good, everything is good. So there had to be the recapitulation at the end. And then, everybody was pleased, no matter what had happened in the meantime. There had to be an optimistic end. That was in music the case, not so much in the drama. Whereas it has something to do with the classical time, naturally. In Goethe dramas, we find that too. That ultimately the good force, etc., was coming through. But there are a lot, and in particular in England, you know that from Shakespeare, ends where the dramatic composition was made in a way that the figures, the drama was naturally finished when everybody was killed. And then there was a natural end. The conclusion was determined by the fact that they could not get out of the tomb and start all over again. At that time. So we have quite a lot of musical compositions which reflect this concept of how to interpret the evolution of the universe, and this comes certainly from the Jewish Christian tradition in our work, because there's that beginning and that end. It has very much to do with the interpretation of the arc of development. A very particular initial moment and a very particular final moment. And then the drama, so to speak, is in between these points. In a completely different way, I could play you a dramatic forming, as a development, but without that traditional load of emotional expressions. And I play you the first, I may even play two movements, of a composition which is called KREUZSPIEL, my very first work. There were still these ideas inside, and they are recurring nowadays in my work again. Because I think never anything is lost, it's just transformed and expanded, enlarged. So the development as a method of composing will always be valid. It is direction, arrow in time. And you hear now the first movement of KREUZSPIEL, crossing game, and what actually happens, if you hear a bit more carefully, rather than listening to it as being a decorative piece, you will hear in the field of the pitches in the beginning 6 notes in the highest octave and 6 notes in the lowest octave. And they are all played by the piano. By the piano. And then one by one, each note crosses through the octaves. Etc. Finish. At the end of the first movement, the 6 notes which were in the highest octave are in the lowest, and vice versa. And the process, the development, can be clearly perceived, because when they reach now into the 2 middle octaves, the 3 middle octaves, then these notes are played by 2 other instruments, by bass clarinet and oboe. So they go through that region, and as each note is leaving the extreme position one after another, one by one, all the octaves, all the space will be filled, until there is a middle section where all the octaves are filled equally, and then towards the end of the first movement, the middle region is again emptied, and the notes are at the edges. So that is a clear development. And it all lasts 2 minutes, not longer. was the beginning of the second movement, I still thought in terms of movements. It was the first composition that I consider being my music, so to speak, music that I have composed, whereas all the works that I composed before were student works, exercises. And that was music which was very much influenced by music like Schoenberg, Beethoven, etc., very dramatic in that other sense. So the second movement of that work then begins in the middle region and spreads out until it fills all the octaves, and with the same crossing of the registers, of the octaves. And then the third movement combines both at the same time, simultaneously. In most of the music that has been composed since 1951, the development has been given up. And it is a shame, I would say. I think in the future, we need, again, more layers within compositions in which there is a strong directionality composed, clear developments. You know that it is a general tendency in literature as well to think that the red thread is something very old-fashioned. The fact that you can follow people within a drama or in a novel, and that the characters have to change to such an extent that you don't recognize the individuals anymore, or people are introduced in a novel and then never reoccur again. Or in dramas, well, I haven't seen too many, but I see them in my mind all the time, where someone is playing a certain role, and then 5 minutes later he comes in a completely different role, and then again in another role, and then another role, the same person. And the recurrence of the same person is not needed at all. But what is needed is the way he occurs, the way he plays it, or the way he appears. That's what I mean. So development must be reintroduced into musical composition. Otherwise it becomes too weak. It becomes it gives too much importance to the individual event. Then the other way of forming is to work with sequences. We know this in music under the terms of variation forms. You have a theme, and not necessarily the theme needs to be your own theme. The greatest composers have composed large variation compositions on the theme of other composers, or on folk tunes. So you just add a series of you add sequences of variations to each other. Another term is the suite. We have the French suite, you have the English suites. And it is nothing but a series of different character pieces, like you find it in pop music, still nowadays. The more primitive or the more simple the music, the more you find sequences, variation forms, and just a change. Let's have a change. From slow movement to a fast movement to a medium movement, a little sad, a little happy, a little aggressive, a little moody, etc. A suite. Like the dance suites of the Baroque time. That's where it all began. And then still in the classical symphony, we have that concept of the suite of 4 movements. The more dramatic one, the more gay one, the more dance one, the minuet, the third, and then the rondo, which is another kind of a dance form, with a recurring refrain. Always the refrain is played together, and then you have some derivations, and then you come always back to the same formula. Sequential forms. I have called it the epic form because you can add and you can play less. I mean, you can subtract. It doesn't change, really. An epic forming. Nevertheless, there have been already attempts, as early as in Beethoven's Diabelli variations, to compose a synthesis of sequential forms, of epic forms and dramatic forms development. For example, the Diabelli variations are a variation form, a sequence of variations, but at the same time he tries to build like an enormous bridge, a unified development within this series of variations. And Webern was always dreaming of the synthesis of the sonata form and the variation form. I give another example of a more recent concept of what a sequential form may sound like. It is my last work, Mantra. I have used a 13-note formula. We played it here in London twice, and last year, and I have explained it several times. And there's nothing but this formula used during the whole time of the composition. The formula is, yes, expanded in its interval and compressed, but it's always that same formula. And the individual characteristics of the 13 notes, the first one being, for example, a note which has an attack at its end. Excuse me. The first note has a periodic repetition. Ta-ka-da-da. The second one has an accent at the end. Ta-ta. No, ti-ta. The third note is a normal note. Ta. The next one has a little ornament at the beginning, ya-da-da-da-da, which can be expanded in many forms, ta-ti-da-da-da, etc. And then the next two notes have the following periodicity, ya-da-di-da-di-ba, which means it is the seed or the cell of tremoli. That it can come of tremolo, which means ya-da-da-da-da or ta, ba, bi, ba, that can come in all speeds. Very fast, very slow, etc. There are 13 characteristics. The next one is, for example, ta-da, an accent at the beginning. These individual characteristics determine then 13 large regions of the whole piece. So in the first region, the periodic repetition is predominant. And the second one, the accent at the end, etc. It is an expansion of one small formula over more than 60 minutes. And I remember when I first thought of that piece, I thought I make a melody which is stretched of a few notes, let's say, 13 notes, which is stretched over 1 hour. And then I bring always smaller formulas, compressions of this melody, related to the individual notes of the melody, of the large melody. And to each of these notes, again, the formula in a smaller compression, etc. So I have worked from the large to the small, in always using the same formula. What we are hearing is a permanent sequence without a directionality, without a clear direction where I'm going. I'm not going anywhere, but more in all directions. I have no clear not one direction in that piece. And please listen now to the result of a musical forming which is absolutely, and I mean that, absolutely sequential. There's nothing but sequential composition. what is the principle of the sequential form? To constantly renew and to constantly repeat. It has been always the secret of the sequential form. And I said at the beginning tonight that we tried, not only me, but many composers, to completely avoid any formula. The same, always different, that I quoted. The theme, the motive. And now in a very new way, the formula is reintroduced into musical composition. Because all the different aspects of the 50s and the early 60s, to deny, to exclude, are now turning again into an all-embracing and more universal aspect of composing. For example, we tried completely to avoid any recognizable rhythm. Periodicity was excluded, because periodicity is easy to capture and to remember. The music was very aperiodic during the 50s. We tried, like the painters in the abstract, so-called abstract or informal period, to avoid any melody that you could whistle afterwards or sing. Because that would capture the attention, and then you would always try to find out what is happening to this melody in the music. So, as I said, always the same light and new object being shown in that light was absolute. Any recognizable musical sound was avoided in electronic music. I tried, I said always, don't imitate the traditional musical instruments, or don't imitate a car sound or a bird, because then people start thinking of the burden of the car rather than listening to the music. But it was a certain weakness that is characteristic for each exclusivity, each system that defines itself with taboos in the art as well as in life. Whereas already with the Song of the Youth, where a boy's voice appears in that strange world of electronic sounds which you cannot name, led me to sentences which were completely misunderstood in the 50s, where I said, it's more interesting to find an apple on the moon than a moonstone. It's much more magic, because a used object, a banal object, takes magic on in such a completely abstract and even informal context where we cannot name the things. If we find a nameable thing, that is totally magic. And all is a question nowadays, what predominates in a piece? When naturally you quote, you have quotations, citations, or you use an object, a found object, the objet trouvé. If it's stronger than what you have composed around, then what you have composed sounds like sauce around a piece that really is strong. And everything that is old is stronger than what is new, because it's known. It has a name, we identify it, etc. One has to be very careful introducing, it must be the opposite, introducing the known into the unknown. Because the known is always, tends to be stronger. Like an old chair, it speaks. The last example is taken from CARRÉ, and we come, like in the other categories, to an extreme again, which is the instant, the moment. The term moment, the way I use it, doesn't mean a short time, a fraction of time. A moment can last forever. A moment can be, as we say sometimes in the current language, a moment can be an eternity. And a moment can be so short that we can hardly experience it. So the absolute time is not characteristic for the moment. What it means is extreme verticality, orientation towards the here and now. Not relating what is happening in music, for example, to what has happened before, like in a development, and what's going to happen next, like in a development. Or in a sequence, where I say what's now is nice because it's now soft and before it was loud. Or it's fast because before it was slow. And next would be good to have something that is in the medium speed, etc., and in the middle range. So always thinking, when you experience something, when you do something, of what happened before and what's coming next. And this general attitude to interpret everything in terms of development has become so extreme. Let's go for a short moment out of the music, that you hardly meet people who can describe something without saying, it was like last year when we were, etc. They describe something that is now, here and now, by something that they have experienced before. They relate it immediately to the past. Or they say, well, now it's not very nice, but it was wonderful at earlier times when I was 20. Or you will have a good time in 30 years, but now it's a miserable time, etc. This total relativation of the now, of what is now, has become predominant in our interpretation of our life and of music too. I remember when I composed as a student, as I say, as an exercise, certain fragments within a given composition, and the teacher said, well, where did you derive it from? I said, from nothing. And he said, well, you need it as a contrast, or what? It's not contrasting. I said, no, I just need it because of itself. He said, you are illogical. Where is the logic? Because you could only think that there's a logic to derive something, to make something that is now, as being, to interpret as the result of what was before, and as the reason for something that's coming next. So realizing this, in several of my earlier compositions where I found I could easily interchange certain moments and it wouldn't change at all, the music, because they were strong enough to exist in themselves. I reversed the whole way of composing. Up to that moment in my work, 60-61, I had composed always with the concept breaking out of continuity. For example, I was obsessed by the idea of composing inserts. I had prepared an entire composition. I saw it in my mind. I heard it in my mind, so to speak. I heard it inside. And then I composed it out. And then, when I was, so to speak, fulfilling my own promises that I had given to myself, or my own systematical preparations, then I found I wasn't satisfied. And I broke into it, and I composed inserts. This you find everywhere, in ZEITMAßZE, in groups for 3 orchestras. Something happens which is not justified. It breaks out. And when you come to an extreme with this feeling, then you compose nothing but inserts. And there's nothing left where it is inserted. And that's what happened in Momente. I started with the extreme opposite method. I said, I want to compose now a musical moment that is existing in itself. It's not related to anything. So naturally, I had determined the number of participants of the performance, the players, the singers, etc. There's already restriction. Then when I started composing the second moment, I tried to avoid everything that I had done in the first one. Not to repeat anything. So if it was for brass, it would be for singers. But then I thought, Jesus, I have to compose more moments, so I better take only the women. And keep the men for another moment. Then percussion, well, be careful, not the percussion yet. So another moment. You see, when you reach the third, the fourth, the fifth moment, then it becomes harder and harder to do something where you don't repeat what you have used before, no matter how far you want to go. So composing always something different, and as different as possible, becomes increasingly difficult. So one has to be extremely economical in order to compose independent or self-contained musical events. And that led me then to an overall planning of an entire composition that lasts nowadays more than an hour and a half, where I really started distributing the forces very carefully in order to create a maximum of individuality of all the different moments. Then, the next thing is that you see, well, there are naturally certain moments which have more in common than other moments. Then there starts the grouping. I say, oh, there's a group of moments where obviously the solo soprano is predominating. There is another group where obviously the percussion is predominating, and that's good, because then we have groups of moments. Finally, I came to a system where then, from that independent situation of all the moments, I started interconnecting the moments. But I was able to determine if a moment was related, not at all, or a little bit, or very much, with the past and with the future. And about that I'm going to talk tomorrow. I give just a short excerpt, the end, from a work which is called CARRÉ, where for the first time I tried to concentrate on the instantaneous forming, or the forming of moments. And it was, at the time when I did it, as I said, quite opposed to everything that has happened. Not in vain, many people have written about the completely illogical way of composing at that time and since. But in the meantime, people have become more familiar with the concept that putting the whole concept of composing upside down and say, I start just with the here and now, and then we will see if there is any past and future. That is a secondary question. That this leads us to a new approach to composition in general. And whereas I have called the development as a dramatic way of forming, directional, the sequential way of forming as an epic, I could call the instantaneous way of forming, the forming of moments, of individual moments, as the lyric. And in our Western tradition, the composition of lyric forms, I can say now, is very rare, extremely rare, because there's a predominating tendency towards sequential composing, forming, and development forming. Whereas, as you certainly all know, in Oriental tradition, let's say in the Japanese tradition, the lyric forming is much more used. The haiku composition in poetry, or the way moments in the note theater are composed, in the note music, occur very often, where the here and now is everything that counts, and they do not necessarily derive or base their composition on the contrast. Like in a note theater, you might just follow moment by moment by moment. Every moment counts, but there's, for long stretches, neither directionality that you feel where he's going to, or where it's leading to, where it's coming from. You don't think about it. You're just fascinated by the counterpoint of the foot, the voice, the hand, the head, the eye, of that counterpoint, and in every position. And you don't care really for a long time, sometimes for 2-3 hours. You don't care about the past, what happened before, afterwards, because there's nothing but that. And he doesn't try to shock or to surprise by changing all of a sudden. And when such a thing comes, a sudden change, then it is incredibly exciting. Then he breaks out of that moment form. We have a few examples in songs of Schubert. And perhaps the first, the beginning of this concentration on the lyrical aspect of forming was, again, in the music of Webern. He composed his early pieces, in particular Opus 5 to the piece for string quartet, but even more the piece for violin and piano, pieces for violin and piano, Opus 7, or the orchestra pieces, Opus 10, or the Bagatellen, in very short, well, we can say movements. These are moments. Psychograms were they called at the time, because the music critics didn't know how to call it. It's extremely condensed, sometimes only 12 seconds, 20 seconds long. That was it. Just put in the air, and nothing derived, and nothing followed, and that was it. Such very strong moments that were like Schoenberg said in the preface of the Bagatellen, whereas others would write a whole novel, this composer just expresses in an instant. Condense, he expresses in an instant what others would write a whole novel about. In extreme concentration. Well, I have in my work one more developed the instantaneous forming, the moment forming. And naturally now we can interpret as a development as one particular organization of moments, and not chop a development into little bits. It's a different method, a different way of thinking, and it leads to different music. I just play the end of CARRÉ for 4 orchestras and 4 choirs. You may realize that the great difficulty in moment forming is that hair-raising problem to create unity. Because what makes unity if everything is based primarily on individuality? Well, it must be the degree of presence, that everything is present. Because as soon as certain events are more present than others, then again, we have secondary things, we have transitions, we have accompaniment, we have preparations, we have echoes, and that means development, or sequences. It is very difficult to compose moments which have equal degree of presence. Something must have become clear tonight, that points can be determinate, variable, statistical. Groups, determinate, variable, statistical. Masses, determinate, variable, statistical. That points being determinate can be in a development. That points being variable can be in a development. That points being statistical can be in a development. That points being determinate can be in sequences. Points being determinate can be in moments, etc. That this order of 3 times 3 terms is an order in which every term can be combined with any other term. And what it is ultimately leading to is not to avoid, as I said before, once we have reached statistical structuring, the point structuring or the group structuring. once we have reached chance operations or statistical ways of composing, to forget about determination and directionality or variability. Once we have reached the lyric, to forget about the dramatic and epic. But naturally, what we are driving at is that universal concept where you have, within a given composition, one layer which is very directional, very dramatic, going from a precise beginning to a precise end and then changing direction, and being with points. Another one is superimposed at the same time and composed with groups which are in sequences, and then a mass is completely momentaneous, instantaneous, superimposed, and then it leads to a section where you have just one characteristic predominant, etc. That all these different aspects begin to intermodulate each other, to influence each other, and are composed, what the word says, composed. So that not from work to work we would have different directions, but within a given composition we would have all the possible forces. Finally, I would like to say, this seems, having been a typical lecture of a typical German professor, who uses his nice terms in order to clarify that wonderfully rich and indeterminable field of music. We have perhaps understood that these terms can be applied to any music, to any folk music, to any traditional music, to any folklore music, to any new music. Why do I do it? As there is that famous sentence, composer or artist create, don't talk. Because I have experienced myself that using these terms has sharpened my consciousness. We could say very sensitive people feel it anyway when they hear the music, and they don't need these mental, this mental material. Well, there is a very secret feedback between sensitivity and consciousness, because ever higher consciousness sharpens the sensitivity, and that is what I am trying to do, and that's why I spent time together with you in telling you about my way of approaching music that I have composed, that others have composed, post facto, after it has been composed, in order to sharpen the consciousness, and with the sharpened consciousness become more sensitive. Thank you for your attention.
So, darf ich jetzt